Forgive me for employing a few numbers at this point. During the fiscal year ending 1 June 1860, the country possessed some 128,300 industrial establishments, of which 110,274 were located in states that remained in the Union. The most heavily industrialized states, New York and Pennsylvania, each had more industry than all the seceding states combined. Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts each had larger property investments than the South as a whole. Finally, the North contributed 92.5% of the $1.9 billion that comprised the total value of annual product in the country in 1860s. While these figures are very well known, we tend to forget them when we delve into the glory and action of war. It is not altogether an error that we do so. Consider the not-so-distant wars with England that were heavily stacked against the nascent United States of America. However, the 3,500 miles of open ocean made the Revolutionary War an entirely different supply operation. Without getting into too much detail, just what is supply to a Civil War-era army? Roughly speaking, it consists of animals, feed for animals, transportation equipment, roads, rails, and water, and the materials for their maintenance, rations, arms, munitions, clothing, camp equipment, and fuel. That last item was very small in wars fought prior to the Civil War, but the use of railroads and steamships changed all that. Going beyond the stuff of supplies, logistics means getting the goods from where they are to where they need to be. I spent 11 years of my career building computer models to solve this problem, and trust me, it is not an easy dragon to slay. Let's come about this in a slightly different way. It is estimated that it cost $1,862 per year to keep a private in the field. At $13 per month, we had wages of $156,862 per year, or $24,960 $2009 per year. The rest, $844,862 per year, would be for support, and that would be $21,100 per year today. So you would get a man in the field for $46,060 $2009 per year. At any one time, the North fielded between 700,000 and 1 million men. Producing these items had actually gotten easier by the time the Civil War got started. The Industrial Revolution meant that arming the common soldier was fairly simple. Give him a mass-produced gun, and you pretty much set. However, both sides had their supply nightmares. In July 1861, the newly appointed Quartermaster General, Montgomery Meigs, was enough concerned about guns that he asked Congress for $10 million to buy weapons in Europe. He saw to it that he had an agent standing by in New York, ready to sail to purchase same once the money was available. It soon became crystal clear that each of the states could not supply the state regiments that were rapidly forming. In order to fully understand this comment, we should spend a few minutes discussing decentralization versus centralization. This is not a new concept, and we are still discussing it today. For example, should a computer program run on your PC or on your mainframe is an example of this balance almost 150 years later. At the time of the American Revolution, the issue was much the same. Should the colonies equip their own armed forces, or should Congress go to countries like France to buy arms for the national army? Although no one knew it at the time, the Civil War would cost the Union 1 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 1 million horses and mules, 1.5 million barrels of pork, 100 million pounds of coffee, 6 million woolen blankets, and 10 million pairs of trousers. Take a minute to let these numbers sink in. All this was done without computerized manufacturing and inventory control. When the conflict began, each state raised its own regiments, the traditional standard building block of a mid-19th century army. This consisted of men and materiel. The manpower was indeed supplied by the state in question. This was not a problem. The supplies, however, were a big problem. It was not the commonly believed issue of corruption, politicians earmarking contracts for their favored producers. Rather, there were only a few companies who had the size necessary to fulfill these large contracts. For example, there were only a handful of arms manufacturers who could even supply rifles and muskets, let alone large-bore cannons. Even textile mills labored to produce the clothing needed to equip the state's huge orders. When President Lincoln called for 75,000 troops on April 15, 1861, state officials were confused about who was going to supply what. Governors across the North wired Washington trying to get a handle on what this call-up meant logistically. Each state began to make purchases, each in their own way. This made for a very decentralized and disorganized pattern of procurement. To make matters worse, national figures like Secretary of War Simon Cameron set up parallel channels of supply and tried to coordinate this effort with the various states. It should come as no surprise that state officials tended to fill military orders by dealing with businesses and workers within their states. It brought a smile to my face to read that when New York first sought to buy uniforms, they gave the whole 12,000-unit award to Brooks Brothers. As a footnote to this tale, the uniforms that they delivered were so badly made that they neither fit nor held up in use. As was often the case when buying from a short list of manufacturers, all of the state procurement officers collided on the same doorstep. For example, when Indiana agent Robert Owen visited New York blanket manufacturer A.T. Stewart and Company, he found that the federal government had gotten there first. By the fall of 1861, Meigs began to do the obvious. He shifted supply from this decentralized system to a more centralized model. This could not be made to work all at one time. So it was not until the spring of 1862 that central supply really took hold. And some local buying was taking place throughout the time period of this presentation. The reason this ship of logistics could not be turned on a dime was somewhat technical, but there was a healthy component of state-federal conflict involved. Illinois was still doing its own supply as late as the Battle of Fredericksburg. For the most part, these exceptions notwithstanding, by 1862 the logistical system of the United States military was centralized, with Montgomery Meigs in control. In the words of Shelby Foote, during the Civil War we went from the United States are to the United States is. This move towards centralization went a long way into making that happen. What he and others did to make it happen is the subject for the rest of this presentation. We should step back for just a moment and see where we are. We started this evening with Bob's question and discovered in the course of 9 examples that the premise on which it was based was false. That realization led to exploring the true nature of supply in the 1860s. Now it is time to investigate just how the people running the show made it happen. This did not happen overnight, as I have implied. The story actually had its birth in 1818 with the arrival on the scene of one Thomas S. Jessup.